We are going to start our conference with our opening plenary for today, Saturday. But before we do that, we again affirm and acknowledge that we are convening at an unceded Coast Salish territory. And again, we thank the Musqueam Nation for allowing us to convene the Shatat conference, the Return and Liberation Conference on their soil. And before we start today, yesterday, as you, some of you or most of you recall, we were supposed to open the conference with a welcoming notes from the indigenous native here in the Coast Salish territory. And our speaker couldn't make it, but he's here with us and he would like to welcome you. Please welcome the indigenous and human rights activist, Stephen Kakinus.
Thank you. Tanse, Niam, Nipoe, Mahigan, Misit, Kakinusit. Hello. I am Standing Wolfpaw of the Tall People. I come from the Woodland Cree Nation of Sucker Creek. My two younger brothers, Reese and Keanu, come from the Musqueam First Nation. I would like to acknowledge the fact that we are, in fact, on unceded Musqueam territory. I'd like to thank you all for coming out here for a very, very important cause. It's inspiring to see the amount of action that's been happening over the past, I would say, 2.5 years throughout the world. It's just amazing the change that's going on in not just the actions, but in the hearts and the minds of everyday people. And it's in rooms like this where that starts. That simple act of simply coming out to an event like this, meeting new people who have different points of view, and that's how we grow. So I want to raise my hands to you in the Coast Salish way for coming out and bettering yourself, but also bettering ourselves as a whole, as a human family. So, Haishka Oseam.
Thank you very much, Stephen. This plenary it's under the title of Looking Back, Forging Forward, Strengthening Our Organizing in the Shatat. We will have two amazing speakers for you, and they will each tackle this very important and huge topic from a different angle. And let me introduce both speakers. We will hear first from brother and comrade Issam Al-Yamani. Issam, he is the long time community organizer in Canada, and he is the executive director of the Palestine House in Toronto, co-founder of the Palestine Film Festival, and he is also, he works with the Coalition Against Israeli Apartheid. Issam has helped throughout his years of struggle to found many Palestinian initiatives, campaigns, and he's also served his people through various different way of organizing from 1984 here in Canada up until today. He is somebody who doesn't give up, and he comes from a family in Palestine that all Palestinians are proud of. Issam maybe doesn't like us to brag about him, but Abu Maher al-Yamani, a legendary Palestinian national leader, is Issam's father. And we're very proud of him. Issam has been also fighting a deportation case for many years in Canada, and he was accused of membership of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. And since then, Issam has been engaged in fighting this legal battle, and we should all support him and stand beside him, because this is standing beside Palestine and not an individual. Our second speaker, Loubna Qutami, she is a very good friend and comrade, and she works and struggles with the Palestine youth movement. She's also she used to be also a very active member with GUPS, the General Union of Palestinian Students. And everywhere there is a real organizing and mobilizing for Palestine, you see Loubna there, whether you're in Brazil or Tunisia or Canada, or Palestine. So I welcome Loubna. We will start with Issam al-Yamani, and he will speak for 25 minutes, and then Loubna will follow. Thank you.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Just a little correction that I wasn't accused of being a member of the PFLP. I admitted that I was a member of the PFLP. Because I believe that as a Palestinian, I have the full right to be affiliated with any Palestinian organization, since we don't have any government that represents us, and this is the only forum of association is to be associated or member of one of the Palestinian organizations. And I'm very proud of my history, and my history made me be with you this morning. My English is not that great, but I'll try to express myself, and I might ask Loubna or Khalid to help me in certain words. And the topic we will be tackling is very complicated, and it has some kind of history, and I feel that it's important that we understand our gathering today as a continuation of the historic struggle and the historic organization of the Palestinian factions and the Palestinian movement. At one point or another, many of us Palestinian activists were members or supporters of this faction or that faction, and we continued after the disintegration of Palestinian factionalism in North America and our activism and doing our Palestinian struggle. And since I'm talking about Palestinian factions, and the topic we are discussing is how to forge our plans for the future, it's important to give a historic background about Palestinian organizations since Al-Nakba, and I will be very brief on that. After Al-Nakba and in the 50s, Palestinian movement was very much affiliated with two schools of thoughts. One represented by Nasserism and affiliated with Abdel Nasser in Egypt, who was pan-Arab and called for Arab unity. And the Palestinian movement that was affiliated with Nasserism was the Arab National Movement, which was founded and established by Dr. George Habash, who were students at the American University of Beirut. And the second factions, or the second school of thought, it was the Ba'athists, who were associated with Iraq, and Syria. And that was before the establishment of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. And here it's worth mentioning that the Palestinian students, whether in the Ba'ath Party or in the Arab National Movement, who were behind establishing those two movements. And that I was discussing with Loubna yesterday that students, they can start a revolution, but unfortunately, for different reasons, and we can discuss it later, they cannot complete a revolution. But their role and your role as students, as youth, is very important and is very essential in regenerating a new Palestinian movement, energizing that the current leadership. In 1964, the PLO was established by a resolution from the Arab League. And it was established for two reasons. The first, there was a conflict between what we call the Arab national regimes, that Nasser and Iraq, Syria, and the reactionary regime, Saudi Arabia, and the others. And each one of them wants the PLO to be its tool. And they want to dominate the Palestinian struggle under the era of the Cold War. The PLO became the umbrella organization of all Palestinian, I don't want to say activists, all the Palestinian national movement. At that particular time, in 1964, the Palestinian bourgeoisie was leading the PLO. And when I say Palestinian bourgeoisie, I mean the Palestinian comprador who used to live in the Gulf state and different parts of the world, as well as the popular organization like the General Union of Palestinian Students, Union of Palestinian Women, Teachers, etc. And the Palestinian factions were not existing as the way they become known after the 1967. There is only two, I think, military organizations, factions that believe in the armed struggle, and they start doing some kind of military action, which is the Arab National Movement and Fatah. And it wasn't announced as such. In 1967, a new era of the Palestinian struggle started, where the PLO became the umbrella organization mainly of all the Palestinian factions and all the Palestinian political parties, and Fatah became the leader of that organization due to many political issues. Fatah was a Palestinian organization that is not affiliated with the defeated regime. They were not affiliated with Nasser. They were not affiliated with the Ba'ath Party. So the Palestinians were disappointed from Nasser and disappointed from the Arab regime, so they followed Fatah as the organization as the alternative organization to the Palestinian people. Within the PLO at that time, there was also two schools of thoughts: the Marxist one and the national one. And if you some of you remember that the Palestinian Marxists were very much influenced by the Maoist thought of strategies and حرب الشعب طويلة الأمد and the armed struggle. And they were the dominant force because the Palestinian Communist Party agreed to the partition plan, so people didn't they didn't affiliate with that. And after September 70, the Palestinian people became more dispersed in the diaspora. And immigration started to the North America Palestinians who were active in Jordan or Lebanon, who thought that after the defeat of the Palestinian resistance in Jordan is the end of the Palestinian struggle and nothing could be done, so people start looking for themselves, and migration started to North America, Canada, Latin America, Europe, and the Soviet Union opened its universities to Palestinian students, so Palestinians start going to the Eastern Bloc, and a new form of organization started at that time. And we, as Palestinians, copied our way of organizing in Palestine, Lebanon, and Syria to North America and other parts of the world. We formed the General Union of Palestinian Students, Women Organization, teachers, engineers, etc. And we started competing each other and spending much time in competing and recruiting Palestinian students or Palestinian community members. And we didn't, as a matter of fact, pay attention to the importance of the solidarity movement. We were very much busy with our internal fights. That continued until the Oslo agreement. I do remember, and Rabab may help me, that the only solidarity movement was the Palestine Solidarity Committee, and used to publish a newspaper, focus, the Palestine focus, and some groups in Europe. And after the Oslo Agreement, a new trend happened. The Palestinian factions, after the first Gulf War, another era of Palestinian activism started in the diaspora. It rolled backward for many reasons. The United States and the European countries were involved in the war against Iraq. The Palestinians were, to a certain extent, pro-Saddam Hussein, and the movements were targeted by different security intelligence, and that continued until the Oslo Agreement, where the main Palestinian organization, Fatah, which was influencing the whole movement, stopped making any kind of activities, as if we are done and we are waiting our state to be established. And the Palestinian left also disintegrated and stopped organizing, and not because they don't want to, but because of listing many of them as terrorist organizations, and we were. I don't know, use they. We were targeted by different security services, and many of you remember the LA-8 case and how it dragged and dragged. So this situation gave the opportunity, because any struggle, any struggle produces its dynamic and its new forms of struggles. And because nature hates vacuum, many Palestinian groups mushroomed or started organizing, but in a different format. We saw the Al-Awda group, the youth networks, and Palestinian youth became more, especially after the Jenin massacre, and this is very important محطة station, a very important and تجديد to renewal of Palestinian activism. Palestinians became aware that this Oslo agreement is not going anywhere, and the leadership of the Palestinian people is giving too much, and a new form of struggle started, whether in North America or in Europe, and it took the form of activists instead of members of Palestinian factions. But I have to say that this movement also was led by members or people who were members of Palestinian factions. Okay, there is 7 questions this panel should answer to, so I spoke about the historic background and the trends of the history of the movement. And the second question I have to address, what has been the historical role of the student workers and women? And I think we briefly discussed that the Palestinian student, or in any revolution, students, unlike even if the movement was Marxist, but the students starts the revolution, and then other people take the leadership and continue with the struggle, and whether in the government or otherwise, like in Egypt, in Tunisia, the students started the January 25th revolution, and the most organized organizations led the government, and that's what happened in Tunisia, that's what happened in Egypt, and that's what happened in Palestine too. In the 80s, also the students, workers, and women were very active. I do remember that the Palestinian gaps in the United States was around 6,000 students, paid members. The women organization won that was around 3,000 women organized, paid, and they used to hold conferences in every city, and they have their own annual meeting every year where they discuss and elect their leadership. The problem with this issue that it was led by factional thinking, and there wasn't attention that we shouldn't copy our forms of struggle from what we are doing in Lebanon. We should do it in the United States or Canada, without considering that the environment, the political environment and the community is totally different. And I do remember that the PFLP used to tell us that you have to make a youth organization. We are not in a refugee camp where a youth organization can be found. We are dispersed all over the world, and that's why it didn't continue. How do we fork our role and revitalize our sense of national responsibility in the Shatat? I don't know how to answer this question, to be honest, but I think we should keep that's all. We should keep organizing and considering that we are a ring in the chain of the Palestinian struggle. We are not supporters of our people in the occupied territories or any other place. We are part of the struggle, and we have to be always to make our voices heard within the Palestinian institution, Palestinian system. In terms of how do our communities currently organize, most of you know how our communities organize. We have different kind of organization. We have village-based communities. We have ideology-based organization, and we have activist organizations in campuses or otherwise. All of them are important. And as a part of the national liberation movement, we should be open to each other. And our work should complement each other. There is Palestinians who doesn't believe in the grassroots movement, who believe in lobbying and this and that. Okay, we should support that. As far as this is helping the whole picture. Some believe in the only thing is we don't have to concentrate on organizing our community. We should give more time to work with the solidarity groups. That's also important, and we should be open to that. I mean that we have to utilize our power, the energies of every single sector of our Palestinian community towards achieving something. And we have to open channels of communication. Like, I didn't see any, in this room, any Islamist activist, maybe. I'm not sure, but I can stereotype. And it's a problem. It's a problem, and we should not ignore the fact that because they are not here, they are not doing anything. They have their own way, and we have to open channels of communication. My time did end. 1 minute. I don't know what to say in 1 minute, but will be answering your questions.
Thank you, Issam.
Thank you.
Good morning. As Khalid mentioned, my name is Loubna Qutami. I am the General Coordinator for the Palestinian Youth Movement International. I'm really honored actually to be sitting on a plenary with Issam and Khalid as the facilitator. I think that this is a really important political time for our communities in the Shatat, for our struggle. And I think that really by having these intergenerational conversations, looking at the past, thinking forward, is the only way that we can really think about our role in our struggle and think about the work that we have ahead of us and think of more creative and thoughtful ways of how to do it. This might sound, well, first I also want to recognize that we are on unceded Musqueam territory, and it's also a great honor that you've invited us here and really been so hospitable and, supporters of this struggle, because they are the same struggle. I mean, settler colonialism in all of its ugliness impacts people in the same ways. And I think that it's so important to always remember for us as organizers, as Palestinian organizers and allies, that Palestine and what's happened in Palestine historically and what's happening in Palestine today is not an occupation and a human rights crisis. It's settler colonialism, and it's not exceptional to all the settler colonial projects that have taken place across the world, but it's part and parcel of a broader global struggle against this monster. And there are many people who share that experience and share that similar conviction in this struggle that are our allies. This might sound strange. I'm speaking at a conference on the Palestinian Shatat in Vancouver, and I'm going to bring up that 2 days ago, Assata Shakur, who is a former Black Panther member and later Black Liberation Army member who's been in exile for nearly 40 years, I think, has been now, 2 days ago, put on the FBI's most wanted terrorist list. And so when we saw that, I was thinking, we were asking, why now? What's this about? And there's tons of probably things that we can think and ask ourselves about in terms of the racial structures and racial oppression in the United States, the belly of the beast, a settler colony as well, but that would be another talk. But the reason I bring it up is because I think that one of the greatest things for us to think about as Palestinian organizers of the Shatat, as Palestinian community members, is that the criminalization of our communities, what Issam talked about in the beginning of his talk, about not feeling apologetic for how we are labeled as criminals for defending our homeland and fighting for justice. That's something that has been one of the largest political frameworks that has impacted Shatat organizing historically and today. In order to understand what our prospective role is, not only should we think about homeland politics and the fragmentation and representation and occupation and continued sort of developments inside of the homeland and the continued developments as a result of the regional changes, but we also have to think about the political developments in the places that we are. And we are in North America. We are in Canada and the United States. And really having to know the legacy of settler colonialism and the legacy of racial oppression in the United States and how it's packaged today in the neoliberal, neo-colonial time in the United States is really important for us to be able to actually know what our role is, who do we work with, who are the natural allies, who are maybe not so much the natural allies, and where we actually have people power and where we have work to do and where we have things to work on in terms of breaking out of the asphyxiating conditions of fear and isolation as the subjects of political repression. I know that there's a workshop later on today about prisons, and I believe that we're going to be talking, Lemis is here, I see. We're going to be talking about some of the FBI repression cases in the United States, but that in and of itself is also only part and parcel of ongoing developments in the United States at the very least. A recent executive summary was released for immigration reform that had so many lines in there that actually warranted surveillance and racial profiling that basically wrapped around all kinds of detention and deportation of immigrant communities around the interest of national security, looking at the history of the consolidation of immigration and citizenship in the United States with the Department of Homeland Security, and looking really at how the US in the last 20 years has become such a robust militarized state is so important, not only to understand the military might that it's supporting in our homeland, but in understanding the power of the communities within where we are to make the difference. The law enforcement industry, from the border patrols to the FBI to the Joint Terrorism Task Force and secret spying and surveillance to local police, gang injunctions, all of that interconnected system is not something as Palestinian communities that we can avoid. It is something that we need to know about, something we need to master, something we need to fight against, and something we need to ally ourselves with our brothers and sisters from the communities that are being impacted by it, because it's the only way we're going to be able to actually draw that connection to the global fight for justice and to really be able to position Zionism and Palestine and make the comparison to what we're experiencing in the Shatat. The second thing that I wanted to talk about was diaspora. I'm really appreciative that I'm getting to share the plenary with Issam, who gave us some insight into the sort of milestones of the Palestinian history, the historical struggle, the liberation project, and leadership. I'm going to focus sort of more on prospects for moving forward and things to maybe consider for both Palestinian communities and especially youth and students. When we think about diaspora, I actually just learned this, by the way, because I'm a student of Dr. Abdel Hadi. So I know she's been referenced a lot in this conference, but she's also my advisor and an exceptional mentor. The term diaspora, we've been using Shatat for quite a while, which is, its literal translation is scattered in English. But the term diaspora was really a term that came out in the late 60s, and in the beginning years really was sort of used to define archetypical cases of diaspora, specifically Jewish diasporas. But later on was really used as a broader term to encompass the many different placeless people who lived outside of their existing homelands. And this term was a way to replace the term dispersed or scattered by adding a political depth to the reason that these populations were scattered and dispersed. To add a political meaning, to add some sort of context that these people are not outside of their homelands voluntarily, they're not necessarily outside of their homelands because they one day woke up and decided to leave their homelands and communities and societies, but that force, punishment, displacement is extraordinarily political and extraordinarily structural. And one of the things that I think has been, unfortunately, a really severe impact, especially after Oslo for Palestinian communities of the Shatat, is the term diaspora became very much internalized as a phenomenon of loss and of disempowerment, of dislocation, that we are ripped out of our homeland, we are generations later very far away from our homeland, we can't seem to locate our role, we can't seem to connect with our population. We're looking at all of the disastrous impacts of the post-Oslo era, the continued annexation of land, the continued occupation, and there's just nothing we could do about it because we are an individual lost from that homeland and can't seem to find our role. And this was something that I think a lot of Palestinian youth probably in the room, when we look into the history of the Palestinian struggle, we have this envy in some ways that as hard as it was, as real as a struggle was, as many martyrs as there were, that there's an envy that there felt that there was a wholeness, that there was a collectivity of Palestinian society at that time, and that our generation lives in this place where diaspora and dislocation is something that's very interpersonal, very internalized, and actually continues to our isolation and subjugation away from Palestine and away from our societies and communities. But actually, the first and most important thing that we must be able to really understand is that just by being a diasporic population, just by being all over the world, the political power that we bear is insurmountable. And the actual existence of being placeless people offers us an opportunity to really be, I'm going to read a quote, to really be able to contest dominant narratives, to be able to contest nation-state hegemony, to be able to contest structural oppression. And for us, as Palestinians of the United States and of Canada, that is critical, because we do live in Western imperial countries. So one of the quotes that actually really was important for me, Lyndon Schultz wrote The Palestinian Diaspora, and she wrote, there is thus an intense and acute difference between the lived, transnational, unbounded, and out-of-space experience of diaspora and the memory of nationalized, rooted, placed, and essentialist past and identity. Being placeless is the fundamental symbol of the decreased role and meaning of the nation state. Insofar as being able to say that just our existence, before we even come together and have conversations in Vancouver, and before we can even come together and organize, and before we really get into depth with the history and legacy of the Palestinian movement inside of North America, in and of itself, this room is full of power. And it's been, so many other diasporic populations have really been rejecting the imposition of loss and powerlessness. And this was a huge concept within Afrocentricity. Molefe Kente Asante, he's an Afrocentrist, a scholar at, I believe, Temple University, wrote, Afrocentricity is generally opposed to theories that dislocate Africans in the periphery of human thought and experience. Such theories see Africans in the diaspora only as creations of Europe, off-centered Atlantic products with little or no agency of their own. And this is the first step that as Palestinians of the Shatat, we have to bring back to our communities. That being in the diaspora doesn't mean we're far away. It doesn't mean we're powerless. It doesn't mean we're victims. It doesn't mean that we're laying under burdens and layers of oppression and can't seem to manage our way out of it, but all we could do is say, the leadership sold us out. The US is supporting Zionism. We have a responsibility and we have a power to be able to channel as diasporic populations, and we have to bring that kind of thinking back to our communities in creative ways. That's so important for us to do. The additional thing I want to say, and now I'm going to probably embarrass her, but I'm going to cite Dr. Abdelhadi's dissertation. The additional thing that I think is particularly powerful in the Palestinian diasporic case is the issue of land. When Dr. Abdelhadi was talking about nationalism, its pitfalls, its strengths, its challenges, and sort of the history of nationalism in the Palestinian movement, she said, here the Palestinian case offers a unique experience to look into the salience of geography in the constitution of national identity and mobilizing collective action. Whether a Palestinian is born inside the territories of historic Palestine, pre-1948 establishment of Israel, or in the diaspora, the inside-outside binary assumes paramount importance. So this sort of brings me to some of the things that I thought that we should be able to talk about today, which is understanding, the plenaries talking about our historical role as Palestinians of the Shatat, our current place, and how to be able to move forward. We're dealing with a lot of binaries. We're dealing with a lot of discourses and structures that really are locating us within a binary of, are we Palestinian or are we American? Are we organizers or are we not involved? Are we with the regime or against the regime? Really being able to get out of the place of being polarized in these conversations around our organizing, I think, is the first step. And I think that in order to do that, there's a couple of things that, for me, are the most important things. There's a workshop later this afternoon that Jackie Hussady is giving on discourse. Discourse is very important. Discourse is very important in the kind of organizing that we're doing, specifically because when we're talking about the more recent trends in organizing, in the formation of Al-Auda in the formation of the USPCN, of the different Palestinian groups that have come up within the last 10 years, also with it, there has been an abundance of different campaigns and initiatives and solidarity-driven efforts that have implemented practices and projects that have actually reshaped the politics and reshaped the discourse and explanation of the Palestinian struggle. It's uprooted it from its settler colonial context. It's framed it as primarily a human rights issue. It's framed it as primarily an issue of settlements in the West Bank and a siege on Gaza. And it completely takes out of context the larger political framework and the larger structural framework that we're working with, which limits our ability to actually be able to explain the context that we're in today and to be able to explain the relationships between Israel and Zionism and the world forces that are implementing these same structures in other people's homelands and amongst people of color in the United States. So I think that getting back to basics and really being able to sort of frame the struggle and frame the current conditions by a thorough explanation of the past that brought us here and a thorough explanation of the political framework that we're living as part of, and really being able to texture the last 20 years of neoliberalism and neo-colonialism that the Oslo Accords have ushered into our Palestinian struggle is really critical in order for us to find the kind of best practices and organizing models to be able to move forward with. There's, you know, for me, some of those binaries that I was speaking about that have been sort of blurred by this, I guess, you know, recent time is the, you know, liberation versus statehood conversation. This has been really critical for the Palestinian struggle and really important for us as Palestinians of the Shatat to consider. Because on the one hand, you know, I'm not going to get into details about the statehood and liberation discussion, but as Palestinians of the Shatat, we're living outside of Palestine. I'm against the notion of continuing to say, where's our voice? Why aren't Palestinians of the Shatat, why aren't the exiles being represented? Why aren't we being accounted for? Why isn't anyone listening to us? Why aren't we sitting at the negotiating table for national body politics or homeland politics? Because the reality is, it's not like there's Palestinians on the inside who are cutting us out for their own interest, and that the Palestinians on the inside are the ones benefiting from it. It is a very small group of people that are benefiting and profiting from this. And our Palestinian brothers and sisters on the inside are suffering way more actually than we are in terms of actually thinking of an occupation in their homeland. And so in order to actually get us out of this place of fragmentation, we have to be considering ourselves as part of a transnational body and not saying that our voice is being excluded or that our political interest is being excluded. That's what I should say. Our political interest is being excluded because what's happening today is not in the political interest of the majority of the Palestinian population, both inside and outside of Palestine. So the liberation versus statehood conversation, I think, is really important. But furthermore, I think also the binary between Palestinian nationalism and, you know, our ability to actually locate Palestine and the struggle for Palestine as part of the broader movement for justice and liberation all over the world, especially in the Arab countries right now. I think that this is something that, you know, we have an opportunity right now to relocate Zionism at the heart of the conversation of the suffering of the Arab world, because that's what it is. It's about colonialism inside of the Arab world. It's not that Israel and Zionism only impacts the Palestinians and that everyone else is living fine and dandy in the Arab world, and we all know that. And this is the time to really be bringing back those conversations about talking about how settler colonialism is not only bad for the people who live within the defined territories of what the United Nations calls Palestine or what the Palestinians call Palestine or the 5% or 8% someone calls Palestine, but it's about actually the people of the region. It's about the annexation of lands. It's about the poverty and dictatorships that people are living in. And it's about the surveillance and political repression that the people in the region have lived in through decades. And so it's so critical to take us back and reconceptualize the history of Palestinian nationalism. Palestinian nationalism, from what I understand, and I could be wrong, was always rooted in international struggle, was always rooted in the belief that national consciousness for Palestine meant that we were for justice and liberation for other communities as well, and that building those alliances was critical for us. And in the recent years, or maybe not in the recent years, but maybe by the dominant narrative that's passed on through generations, what we understand is the Palestinians are the victims, no one has supported them, and we are leading our cause in isolation. And I think that this is really important to explore the historical legacy of the cross-movement relationships between Palestinians and other communities and other struggles, both inside the region and globally. And secondly, to actually have a critique, to have self-reflection about the ugliness of nationalism at times, the ugliness of trying to create umbrellas and unify people and pretend that there's no difference, or know that there's difference, but subdue the people that are less popular because we don't feel that we can be a powerful body with difference. And that's going to bring me to my next quote. Stuart Hall, Cultural Identity and Diaspora, said that diaspora was defined not by essence or purity, but by the recognition of necessary heterogeneity and diversity, by a conception of identity which lives with and through, not despite difference, by hybridity. Diaspora identities are those which are constantly producing and reproducing themselves anew through transformation and difference. Is it still working? Okay. Through difference. And I think that this is also something how am I doing on time?
About 3 to 4 minutes.
Okay, great. So this is something that I think is really important for us to consider today, and it's going to lead me to my last point, which I touched on a little bit earlier. I think as Palestinians of the Shatat, we have to be able to really work with our communities and breaking out of the ideas that in order to be powerful, in order to be connected to the homeland, in order to make any kind of real change, we have to be unified. And that unity has to be based on we all have to vote for the same representative, or we have to have some sort of democracy that is based on popular consensus. I think it's about creating currents within our societies, within our communities, in the Shatat, in which we understand that difference can be an asset to our struggle and not a deficiency, and in which difference can actually difference when organized, right? So I'm not saying we should all be different and then all come together in academic forums and talk about how different and pluralistic we are and appreciate our diversity. I mean organized difference. I mean organizing our difference and channeling our different strengths and power. As Issam said, our different strengths and power depending on where we are locally, depending on the skill sets that we have, in order to actually generate an experience as a collective society that has shared visions, shared political visions and aspirations towards the future of our struggle, people, and homeland. And only through organizing through difference can we come to that shared consensus. Elections is not going to help us come to a shared vision as a Palestinian people. Elections today is not going to help us come to a shared vision in which we can actually come to the table, elect a new representation, and say they're going to be a better representation because the former representation really just didn't represent us because they didn't know how, or really just didn't represent us because they didn't want to, or really just didn't represent us because they sold out. We have to see the place that we are in today as part of a colonial condition. A colonial condition that has historical roots, that brought our historical formations and political entities to where they are today, that people didn't one day just wake up and decide that they were going to change the trajectory of the Palestinian National Liberation Project, but in fact, it was an outcome of what the colonial condition brought us to. And in order to get out of that outcome, in order to take this struggle back to a place in which the pressure against Zionism and the pressure against colonialism is mass, and it is deeply entrenched in society, and it is deeply permeating amongst allies, and it becomes the widespread thing that we want, we have to organize. That's not going to happen through elections at this time. There is no such thing as elections or representation or worth fighting about who's the legitimate or authentic representation or principled or non-principled representation or ideologically aligned or non-ideological representation until we organize. And I do think that political formations have a role to do in that. I'm not saying that we should do away with those formations. I'm saying that the return to be able to bring together the Palestinian struggle is through organizing and through rebuilding that transnational Palestinian body and through creating an experience in which new generations can live through difference on a transnational level.